All right, so there's a new document or two in the Idaho 4 case, rulings by Steven Hippler, the judge in the Brian Kohberger case overseeing that case. And these documents, I have to say, are very depressing. At the end of the day, the summary of this is, do I believe that Brian Kohberger is really, truly going to get a fair trial? No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't. I'm coming to the realization, the more I watch how this court is conducting itself, how Steven Hippler conducts himself, I don't believe Brian Kohberger truly is going to get a fair trial. Now, before we get too deep into the document today, because I want to review the redacted order of the defendant's offer of proof regarding alternate perpetrators. This is Steven Hippler's ruling on Ann Taylor's perpetrators and alternative perpetrators. And the good news is we're going to get information about how many alternate perpetrators Ann Taylor basically talked about, a little bit of details about who they are, some guesses from my mind about who they are, and it's all going to be new and interesting and exciting information, except for the whole part about Steven Hippler isn't probably going to give a fair trial in this situation, and that seems abundantly clear in my personal opinion. Now, having said that, some might ask the question, well, can Steven Hippler be removed as a judge if he's not going to preside over a fair trial? Unfortunately, getting a judge removed from a case is extremely, extremely difficult. So Hippler is going to run shot over this thing the way that he's going to do it. And let me also make one more caveat about Steven Hippler. I believe in our court system and upholding the final decision. So here's what sucks about the bottom line of this. Do I believe Brian Kohberger is going to truly get a fair trial? No. At the end of the day, however, when Brian Kohberger's verdict is read, we have to accept as a nation that verdict, whether or not he got a fair trial or not. And we have to go by the process. So if Steven Hippler did something wrong and there's a motion filed about his prejudice, then so be it. And we'll move on to an appeals system. If during the course of action, Hippler doesn't allow the defense to do something that should have been allowed by any judge in his right mind, again, we'll let the appeals process play out. But at the end of the day, here's what's going to suck for all of us. If you don't believe that Brian Kohberger got a fair trial, we still have to, at the end of the day, accept Hippler's ruling over that court system and let the appeals process play itself out. So let's get into the documents and why I think Hippler is not being fair and not being. And let me make it one more point too. I'm going to attend that trial. I'm going to attend or I'm going to do my best to be at Brian Kohberger's trial. And when I'm in the courtroom, I will show Steven Hippler the utmost respect for his position. His position of that judge as the judge of that courtroom demands respect. I will stand when I'm told to stand. I will show Your Honor every bit of respect, and we will abide by that judge's wishes and his rulings and treat him with the respect that his position deserves. That's what we are supposed to do in this country if we believe in a rule of law. Now, again, my personal opinions about the man, I don't think he's being fair. I think Hippler has made up his mind that Brian Kohberger is guilty and basically bends over backwards as much as possible for the prosecution anytime they want something done, and he basically shuts down Ann Taylor anytime she wants something done. It's clear, in my opinion, bias, but proving that and getting a judge dismissed or whatever, not going to happen. And so at the end of the day, you just have to accept that this is the way our court system works. If you have a judge that's biased, good luck with that. There's an appeals process for a reason. So a higher level court can look at whether or not something was done improperly by Hippler. And some people out there are suggesting that Hippler is doing this on purpose, that he wants a mistrial. I don't think it's the case. I think Hippler just simply, as a former prosecutor and all those things, he just has it. He just believes Brian Kohberger is guilty, and it's a waste of everyone's time to have this trial. He's bored with the trial. He doesn't want to go through with it. He thinks it's a waste of everyone's time and money. Everybody knows what happened, and so therefore this is a colossal waste of his time. Unfortunately, those of us who believe in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty wished he would show a little bit, at least make an attempt to look like you're going to be impartial. But that's not going to happen. Let's get into the document today, because there's some interesting things. There's the best of times. There's the worst of times. Steven Hippler's ruling on the alternative suspects. And by the way, before I get into this, just in case you didn't hear, the trial date has been moved back to August I believe 18th now. It was going to be the 11th. Now it's August 18th. So it's been pushed back a week. And also the jury selection has been pushed back a week. So it was going to be on, I believe, starting on the 30th of July. It's not going to start, I think, August 4th. So dates have shifted by 1 week because, again, Hippler shut down the continuance motion, the request to let's postpone this because we're not ready. Too bad. You get an extra week. And I'm not even sure that he was giving them an extra week because he was giving them an extra week. It's more like other things were going on. An extra week was just what was necessary for whatever. I don't think it had anything to do with Ann Taylor's desire. Hippler doesn't give a shit what Ann Taylor's desire is in the matter. And there is a question in my mind, by the way, on whether or not Ann Taylor is really doing the best job that she can for Brian Kohberger. But let's get into the document that I have so freaking long-windedly avoided. So, introduction. And I'm going to shut down real quick an audio thing because I just realized I got something open that's going to keep making bloops, bloop, 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 in the background. All right, introduction. The state previously moved in limine, seeking to preclude the defendant, the Brian Kohberger, from offering or arguing alternative perpetrator evidence without first satisfying the applicable evidentiary standards. In accordance with the court's subsequent order on the motion, defendant filed his offers of proof and evidence in support, identifying 4 individuals as potential alternative perpetrators. There's some new information, some numbers. There are 4 alternative suspects that Ann Taylor has identified on behalf of her client, Brian Kohberger. The state had basically said, we don't want them offering the idea that there could be alternative perpetrators. And if she does, she better damn well have good proof. And so now the judge is ruling on, did she have good enough proof? So she gave me 4 names. Is it good enough proof? Bottom line is, no, Ann Taylor, I reject your reality and substitute my own. That's Steven Hippler. There's a quote from Steven Hippler via me. I reject your reality and substitute my own. All right, here we go. So the state, of course, objects to the presentation of this evidence at trial, arguing it fails to satisfy the standards under State versus Meister, 148 Idaho 236 220, paragraph 3D, 1055. I'm not even sure if that's paragraph, maybe page 3. I don't know. 2009. Now, I'm not going to, sometimes I dig into the legal documents. I don't want to dig into the legal documents today. Let's make this relatively brief, even though I'm probably looking at 30 minutes on this video. All right. So let's get into this. Now, this is what's good. Here's the only good caveat. There's like 2 little good pieces. Here's one of the only 2 good pieces. Defendant conceded. So that's Brian Kohberger. And again, all of this is done on behalf of Brian Kohberger. So we're being worded as if the defendant's asking these things and he's asking those things, when really it's his female attorney who's asking on behalf of her male client. Let's get that word. So when you get the he asks for this and he asks for that, that's Brian Kohberger, as asked by his female defendant or defender, Ann Taylor. The defendant conceded at oral argument that at this point, Brian Kohberger's, proffer offered by Ann Taylor is not sufficient to pursue an alternative perpetrator theory at the outset of the trial, but requests latitude in cross-examination of the state's witnesses to try to establish additional evidence to satisfy the Meister standards. Right there, that's a big sentence and a big follow-on paragraph. Let's read it again, and then I'm going to read it one more time what I just read, because I feel like the way I read it and slowed down, you're going to miss the point. And then I'm going to go right into that second paragraph to give you the totality of it. The defendant conceded at oral argument that at this point, his proffer is not sufficient to pursue an alternative perpetrator theory at the outset of the trial, but requests latitude to cross-examine of the state's witnesses to try to establish additional evidence to satisfy the Meister standard. The court concludes that at this time, defendant's alternative perpetrator proffer is inadmissible under Meister, as it is irrelevant and or excluded by IRE 403. However, it does not foreclose the defendant from cross-examining law enforcement regarding reasonableness of its investigation and its follow-up on plausible leads. Okay, here's the great news. Here's the only great silver lining of this whole thing. It's basically saying Ann Taylor concedes to the judge's ruling. No, Ann Taylor, you don't have enough to support an alternative suspect or perpetrator. So Ann said, okay, I concede. We don't have enough yet. But will you allow us on cross-examination to question the state's witnesses, law enforcement, about and develop this a little bit further in trial? And the judge Thank God, Steven Hippler. Yeah, you haven't completely rejected reality and substituted your own. You will concede that Ann Taylor is allowed to cross-examine law enforcement and question whether or not they really truly developed people's alibis properly, did their due diligence, or whether they ruled people out too early. Because at the end of the day, that's what's happening here. Ann Taylor is going to take the opportunity, in my opinion, this is my interpretation of the legal documents, and I'm not a lawyer. I tell you that from time to time. I'm not a lawyer, but my interpretation is Ann Taylor intends to suggest that law enforcement too quickly ruled out alternative suspects, didn't do their due diligence, the alibis are not as solid as law enforcement said, and she wants to be able to cross-examine them on the witness stand about how they'd established those alibis, because some of the people that the law enforcement ruled out shouldn't have been ruled out. That's going to be Ann Taylor's only opening in this. So she's not allowed to come forward and tell the jury about potential alternate suspects or alternate perpetrators, but she is allowed to at least question law enforcement about whether or not they really did their due diligence when ruling out alibis, because 3 of the 4 perpetrators that Ann Taylor brings forward were people that I believe were cleared by law enforcement, and Ann Taylor believes that they should not have been cleared. So there's her only opening. Are you following the logic? Her only opening is the judge is going to allow her to cross. Wow, what a great move, Hippler. You're going to allow her to cross-examine people. Shit, that's part of freaking court systems in the first place. Everyone's allowed to cross-examine the witnesses. Thanks, Hippler, but at least he's conceding. At least in writing, he's saying, okay, you know what? If you want to keep pushing the whole alternate suspects thing on cross-examination, if you can finagle it out and prove that law enforcement did something wrong, which, by the way, his attitude is they didn't do anything wrong. But if you can do it somehow, I'll let it fly. We'll relook at the whole alternate suspects thing if you can trip up law enforcement on the stand. It's a little silver lining, not much at all. All right, analysis. All right, the seminal Idaho case on the admissibility of alternative perpetrator evidence is Meister. Prior to Meister, a defendant wishing to present such evidence at trial had to first present proof of a connection with the crime, such as a train of facts or circumstances, as tend clearly to point out someone besides the accused as the guilty party. Remote acts, disconnected and outside of the crime itself, cannot be separately proved for such a purpose. State versus Larson, blah, 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 blah. Meister clarified that the Idaho rules of evidence, rather than more onerous Larson standard, control alternative perpetrator evidence admissibility. All right, where is this going? At the end, let me run this through the universal translator. This is what pisses me off about Hippler's legal speak, which is a little convoluted. His legal speak is basically this: you better have a real good reason why somebody else could have done it, because the only person that really we know could have done it is Brian Kohberger. Multiple times, it's a foregone conclusion that somehow Brian Kohberger had motive, but every other alternative suspect did not have motive. And unless you can prove that they had a stronger motive than Brian Kohberger, what the hell is Brian Kohberger's motivation? He doesn't like women. He was failing out of school, and his only choice after failing out of school is he must kill somebody. Or maybe that they rebuffed him at a restaurant that we can't prove they ever had any interaction with, and maybe that pissed him off and he had to go. What exactly is it you think is Brian Kohberger's great motivation for killing 4 people in a house that had other people there and going in? What exactly? At the end of the day, I really want you to tell me, Hippler, what it is you think Brian Kohberger's clear motivation is, that nobody else has a better motivation, not a jealous ex-boyfriend. He literally, basically, in this document will tell you a jealous ex-boyfriend doesn't have more of a motive than Brian Kohberger. What the is Brian Kohberger's motivation? He's angry at women in a mysterious world that doesn't exist because you've shown no evidence. Maybe some girl insulted him and he decided he had to kill people, or he was dropping out of school and the only choice anybody has when you're dropping out of school is to clearly kill 4 people because that's the only. What other choice do you have left? What the hell is his motive? What the hell is his motive? Oh, maybe he was obsessed with serial killer. Oh, and he'll call every other alternative suspect theory wild, crazy speculation. But for Hippler, we know exactly why Brian Kohberger did this. And again, at the end of the day, Hippler, despite this, in your courtroom, I will show respect. Now, hopefully Hippler doesn't see this video and doesn't even let me into his courtroom, because there's probably a small world in which Hippler can be like, yeah, devil's advocates is not coming in my courtroom. He flipped me off on camera. We'll see how that goes. But again, in his courtroom, I'm going to treat him with respect. Under these rules, evidence is relevant if it has any tendency to make the existence of any fact that is of consequence to the determination of the action more probable or less probable than it would be without the evidence. All right, there's a lot of legal speak. Meister further offered the following guidances on applying these rules. If the defendant proffers evidence which merely tends to mislead the jury that another person committed the crime, for the love of God, man, at the end of the day, is not reasonable doubt. The entire purpose of reasonable doubt is to give the idea to the jury that somebody else could have had a better motive. Somebody else could have done this. And if somebody else could have done it, then you can't definitively say that my guy is the only guy who could have done it. If there's other people, but that's what he's basically saying. Hippler is using his interpretation of the law to say that coming up with an alternative suspect, that somebody else could have done it, is simply misleading the jury. As the title of my video will show you, in Hippler's world, the only person who's allowed to be guilty is Brian Kohberger. He's the only one allowed to be guilty. Anything else is crazy conspiracy theory and just misleading the jury about who we already know who did it. There is no fairness, in my opinion, in Hippler's attitude about this thing. We already know who did it, and any attempt to come up with an alternative suspect or reasonable doubt is just misleading the jury. Wild speculation. All right, let's continue on. More inferences that another person could have committed the crime will most likely not be relevant. And if relevant, will still be subjected to the limitation provision of IRE 403. A defendant has no right to present irrelevant evidence. And even if evidence is relevant, it may be excluded in certain cases. So again, for example, a jealous ex-boyfriend who just had his girlfriend break up with him 3 weeks ago and may have been losing his dog and his girlfriend to a job in Texas and whatever, all of that is completely irrelevant. That's wild-ass speculation that anybody like that could have motivation. Instead, the only motivation that makes sense is that a college student who doesn't like women decided that the only option he had from not liking women was to go murder 4 of them in a house of 6 people and leaving witnesses behind, because it's the only thing that makes logical sense to Hippler. Anything else is wild-ass speculation. Like the primary motive in any kind of homicide like this is the spouse, the love interest, the person who has motive because they love somebody so much that if I can't have them, nobody else can have. But that's wild-ass speculation according to him, because, as Hippler will tell us in this document, Jack DeCoeur, he doesn't mention my name, I'm reading between the lines, he has an alibi. So suggesting that he could have been involved is not true, because he had an alibi. So it's wild speculation. All right. Purple section means I'm kind of changing his train of thought. Here the evidence the defendant has proffered purporting to establish the 4 individuals as alternative perpetrators abjectly fails to meet the Meister standard. And there's a footnote here. In addition, the evidence largely consists of inadmissible hearsay. The defendant contends, however, that the Chambers versus Mississippi rule, hearsay tending to establish third-party culpability, may be admissible to protect the defendant's constitutional rights to a fair trial, and on and on and on. It talks about the 6th and the 14th Amendments. It starts to get into legalese. It starts to get confusing. The point being is that they're arguing about whether or not the defendant has the right to bring up alternative perpetrators. Namely, the evidence is entirely irrelevant. So here let's go back to the beginning. Here the evidence defendant has offered purporting to establish 4 individuals as alternative perpetrators abjectly fails to meet the standard of the Meister standard. Namely, so he's explaining why, the evidence that the defense has submitted is entirely irrelevant. Nothing links those individuals to the homicides or otherwise gives rise to a reasonable inference that they committed the crime. Indeed, it would take nothing short of rank speculation by a jury to make such a finding. Screw that. Brian Kohberger, the prosecution has already used rank speculation as to why Brian Kohberger needed to go kill 4 college students. So it's okay in Hippler's reality for us to just use wild rank speculation about why Brian Kohberger might be compelled to murder 4 individuals in which the prosecution has admitted under oath had no relation to them whatsoever. Brian Kohberger was not stalking the girls. That has been admitted to in court by the prosecution. Yeah, we admit Brian Kohberger wasn't stalking any of the girls. So therefore, I would argue there is no freaking motivation of Brian Kohberger to kill 4 people, but yet that's going to stick as the only thing that makes sense. And anything else is just rank speculation, like a jealous boyfriend who obviously would have more motive than some random guy that you say has no connection. The boyfriend who is connected, that's rank speculation. The guy in a college campus next to this campus, completely different college campus with no connection to the girls, that's the only thing that makes sense in this case. 3 of the individuals, we're hearing more details now. 3 of the individuals were each socially connected to one or more of the victims, interacted with one or more of the victims at social events in the hours prior to the homicide, lived within walking distance of the crime scene, and were familiar with the layout of the victim's home from prior social events. So we now know 3 of the 4 people Ann Taylor has brought forward as alternate suspects are people who are within walking distance of the house. Who could that be? I wonder who lived really close to the house, knows the floor plan of the house, has been in the house multiple times. I can't think of a single person who fits that criteria. Anyways, so while perhaps this evidence could suggest an opportunity to commit the crime, which no doubt is an opportunity shared by dozens of others in the victim's social circles, there is no compelling evidence that any of them had a motive to kill the victims. No, the only motive that makes any effing sense is a guy that hates women and decided that the only choice that he had in life was to go kill 4 of them randomly in some town. That's the only thing that makes sense. Everything else makes 0 sense. There's no logic whatsoever. Nobody has any motive that's better than random incel that can't get laid deciding that he's angry at women and has to go kill 4 people. This is why I say Hippler's bias is so clear, that he thinks that whole logic makes, that's clear logic to him, clear. We know what happened. It's a guy that has no connection to the women at all, who just decided that the only thing that he has left in life, the only choice he has left in life is to go kill 4 people because he might have been failing out of school. Or maybe, again, 4 different theories. Maybe he was writing a love letter to his professor about being obsessed with serial killers. And again, no proof of that whatsoever, but it's a hell of a lot better motive than the jealous ex-boyfriend or the drug connection or any other half a dozen theories that actually have meat to them, like the drug dealers that live nearby. Those kind of things, that's wild ass speculation. It has to be the incel next door. All right, and so he goes on to explain, furthermore, there is no evidence connecting them to the crime scene. I bet you dollars to fucking donuts, those people who have been to the house, according to Hippler, and had been in the girls' social circles, has evidence in the house. How do you go to the girl's house? You tell me, Hippler, how you go to the girl's house and you admit that these other suspects have been in the house, have relations with the girls, and have been in the house, but there's no evidence of them in that house. Bullshit. Their DNA is in that house. If they've been in that house, I will 100% guarantee you every one of those mother effers DNA is in that house because they've been in the house. Brian Kohberger left one tiny piece, you say, of DNA in the house. But these other people who have been in the social circles and hanging out and partying with the girls, maybe sleeping with one of the girls, their DNA is not at the house. There's no evidence linking them to the house. Their freaking DNA, I'll guarantee you, is all over that house. What are you thinking? What are you thinking? I don't. Furthermore, these 3 alternatives who have relations to the girls and have been in the house and know the floor plan of the house and would have been able, for example, because they know the floor plan, be able to walk that house in a timely fashion in the dark and maybe more likely been able to commit 4 murders in about 8 minutes on 2 separate floors in the dark because they know the floor plan. That makes no sense whatsoever to Hippler. That's absolutely asinine, wild ass conspiracy theory. Only a person who's never been in the house before, has no idea where he's going, is likely to have been able to pull that shit off. These alternative suspects we're talking about, perpetrators, the 3 of them, they have each cooperated with law enforcement, providing DNA samples, fingerprints, and allowing searches as requested. Notably, lab testing has excluded their DNA from samples taken from the crime scene and the victims. Well, that's great for you. Again, I 100% guarantee you all three of those people, if they've been in the house, their DNA is in that house. So first of all, you can kiss my ass on the whole law enforcement ruled them out. Law enforcement's handling of this thing is part of the problem. Law enforcement's handling of this is what we're arguing about was done improperly. So you just continue to say, hey, law enforcement already cleared these people. Therefore, you're stretching. You're reaching at straws because law enforcement ruled them out. End of effing story. Nobody can question law enforcement. Again, he did leave the caveat, Ann Taylor is allowed to question law enforcement on the stand. You're allowed, Ann Taylor, I guess, I'll allow you to cross-examine law enforcement, I guess. The fourth individual did not know the victims, but had a passing connection to one of them, I believe Kaylee, while noticing her shopping at a store approximately 5 weeks prior to the homicide. He followed her briefly out of the exit of the store while considering approaching her to talk. He turned away before ever speaking to her. The event was captured on a surveillance camera. This individual subsequently cooperated with law enforcement, providing his phone number and a DNA sample. Well, that's it. He can't fucking possibly have been the guy. He provided his phone number. Okay, good. That would be complete wild ass speculation. Of course he's been ruled out. He provided his phone number and a DNA sample. And because, again, by the prosecution's own word, the reason why we didn't test unknown male B blood inside the murder scene on the banister, unknown male B, a second unknown male in the house, or the unknown male DNA in the glove outside. The reason why we didn't go down those paths too far is because we already know who did it. Brian Kohberger's DNA was on the knife sheath. There was no need to further test those other DNA and come up who they. So we know that guy's DNA didn't match the sheath, so he couldn't be the guy because he didn't match the sheath. So he's been excluded. All right, so now we know the four. We know three individuals know the girls and have been in the house before. Therefore, ergo, whatever freaking word you want to use, I will argue again, that means their DNA is in that house. If the three individuals who have been ruled out have been in the house, their DNA is in the house. For Hippler to say there's no DNA linking them to the scene, their fucking DNA is all over the house. Pardon my French. I'm sorry I'm using the F-bomb. I try to do it just sparingly. Their DNA is all over that house. So no DNA is linking them to the scene, but they've been into the house and they know the house layout. Okay. As with the other alleged alternative perpetrators, lab reports excluded his DNA from the samples taken from the crime scene and the victims, and there is no evidence connecting him to the scene. Great. So I'm sure you all did your due diligence. I'm sure there's no problem with it whatsoever. The law enforcement has been completely upstanding in this whole case and have been acting with great faith and due diligence and have not been playing games and hiding how they're developing DNA profiles, lying about how they're getting DNA profiles, using unsanctioned methods to go to ancestry databases, putting pressure on things to go into trash, and then still not linking Brian Kohberger, but linking it to a biological likelihood that the victim's father is this, whatever. Screw you guys. You guys have done great. You guys have done fantastic. There's no arguing the facts. The fact, here's a footnote, the fact that these individuals lived within walking distance to the, I'm losing my shit right here. The fact that these individuals lived within walking distance to the crime scene is not probative evidence, given that the perpetrator, I can't read this with a straight face, given that the perpetrator drove a vehicle to the crime scene. Further, none of these individuals drove a vehicle matching the description of the suspected killers. Oh my God, Steven Hippler, are you not qualified to rule over a death penalty case? Are you kidding me? So for Hippler, it's a foregone conclusion that the killer arrived in the vehicle. We don't even know that. That hasn't been proven. We don't even know that car is Brian Kohberger's, and we don't know if that car was involved in the murders. Just because a car was seen going around the neighborhood at the time and seen parking outside of near the residence and then leaving near the residence, it doesn't prove that car or the occupant of the car was the killer. But according to Steven Hippler, we know for a fact that was the killer and that the killer arrived by a car. Therefore, we can rule out all three alternative suspects who live within walking distance of the house because they didn't drive a car. Why would you drive a car to a crime scene if you live within walking distance? Toss them all out. There's no reason to talk. We know that the killer came in a car. It makes no sense that somebody who lives nearby then could walk to the house, would drive a car, so therefore they are excluded. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I have to wonder sometimes if Hippler is qualified to make rational decisions. That's the most ridiculous thing, in my opinion. And that's all you're coming here for, is my opinion. In my opinion, that's one of the most ridiculous. It made me laugh. Now I'm angry. All right. Collectively, the defendant's proffer with regard to these four individuals fails to give rise to even an inference that they committed the crimes, or otherwise make it more or less likely that the defendant was the perpetrator. Therefore, it is irrelevant under IRE 401. So in other words, none of the alternative suspects you had have a better motive than the incel motive that he just hates women and decided he had to go kill four random people because he hates women, and maybe got rebuffed by one of them, but we can't prove it, and had no connections to the girls whatsoever. That is way stronger. Nothing that you could provide of the four people next door, like the ex-boyfriend, none of that has a better motive than Brian Kohberger, the incel. Defendant has provided no probative, admissible, significant evidence of motive, ill feelings, means, presence at the scene, or any other connection to the crime that could possibly move the ball to the extent that it supports an alternative perpetrator theory. I guess nobody would suspect jealous ex-boyfriend. That's still on my list, still top on my list. But according to Hippler, no, there is nothing that even remotely moves you in a different direction than the incel from another college next door. Because a jealous ex-boyfriend makes zero sense. It's not more likely to be the case than the incel next door who had no connection to the girls. At best, the defendant's offer of proof can give rise to only wild speculation that it is possible any one of the other four individuals could have committed the crimes, which is inadequate under Meister. Now, again, I haven't read all of Meister. I don't want to get into the huge legal fight at this moment, but I might ask my attorney friend, Ali Benevento, who comes on my show from time to time, to break this down, because again, as a lay person, I would think that reasonable doubt is the suggestion that somebody else could have done it other than my guy. If somebody else could have done it other than my guy, then how can you definitively say it's my guy? But Hippler is literally saying all you're doing at best is raising the possibility that somebody else could have done it. Like reasonable doubt. What the hell's wrong with you? Of course reasonable doubt is somebody else could have done it. So how do you know it's my guy? Well, no, at best, all you can do is suggest that somebody else did it. What? But again, maybe I actually do feel I'm probably missing something about Meister. Like, I feel like if I get an attorney on here, they're going to be like, well, what he really means is this, and I'm going to miss something, and I'm going to look like a jackass. But in my layperson's mind, the whole idea of a reasonable doubt is, could somebody else have done it? And just like they did in a recent case, when the jurors found, Karen Reed not guilty. Well, if she didn't do it, who did? Not my problem. Not my job. My job isn't to find who did it for you. My job is to say, could somebody else have done it? All right. Again, mere inferences that another person could have committed the crime will most likely not be relevant. Most likely. Sounds like it should be relevant to me. If somebody else could have done it, then how do you know it was this guy? In other words, it is not sufficient for a defendant to merely offer up unsupported speculation that another person may have committed the crime, which is all the defendant has done here. Steven Hippler's words are clear. He believes Ann Taylor is wasting his time. There is nothing that moves us away from Brian Kohberger is the guy because he hates women and had to kill four people because there was no other choice he had in front of him. Even if there was Hippler goes on, even if there was a shred of probative value in the proffered evidence beyond wild speculation, God, Hippler makes me angry. I'm so pissed. Everything you do, Ann Taylor, is just wild ass speculation. But all the prosecution's theory about why Brian Kohberger did it, that's solid effing evidence. Solid evidence. Perfect motive. Makes completely sense. Your shit, wild speculation. Our shit, it's the only thing that makes logical sense. As the 10th Circuit noted, alternative perpetrator evidence, it is not sufficient for a defendant merely to offer up unsupported speculation that another person may have done the crime. Such speculative blaming intensifies the grave risk of jury confusion, and it invites the jury to render its finding based on emotion or prejudice. What the hell do you think the jury is doing right now? What do you think any jury in America is going to do right now? They're going to make a decision to kill Brian Kohberger on emotion and prejudice. Prejudice? 4 or 5 different documentaries, 2 or 3 different books on Brian Kohberger, all telling us that Brian Kohberger is guilty and is a monster. That is prejudice and emotional thinking. And you're going to show tons and tons of photos of those murdered girls, and you're going to get everybody to weep in the courtroom and gasp in awe about how horrific and you're going to play on emotions. But fuck you if you suggest that if you bring up an alternative suspect, all you're doing is playing on the jurors' emotions and trying to use emotion and prejudice to get them to think that somebody else could have done it. I feel like I'm in the freaking Twilight Zone. Are you kidding me? So the media has already biased the public, already prejudiced the public, and it is going to be an emotional shitstorm in that courtroom. But to suggest that somebody else did it is just going to confuse the jury and play upon their emotions. This will not be a fair trial. But we're going to have to accept the consequences. We're almost done, and then I'm out. I feel like I've gone much longer than I should have, and I'm on a huge rant. Likewise here, presentation of the proffered alternative perpetrator evidence would pose a great threat of confusing the issues. Well, let's stop there. If you bring up the idea of alternative suspects, it's just going to confuse people. They might suggest that Brian Kohberger didn't do it. We can't have that in the courtroom. You're just going to confuse people. If you bring up the idea that other people might have had motive and might have had opportunity, that's just going to confuse people. It's going to confuse the issue at hand. Brian Kohberger is the fucking killer. So don't confuse that. Let's stay to the task, people. Brian Kohberger is the killer. Anything else is just going to add confusion to the case. It adds a great threat of confusing the issue because it would force the state to defend against nebulous allegation that perhaps those individuals were involved. This foray would lead the jury astray, they might actually move away from the idea that Brian Kohberger is guilty, and we can't have that shit. This foray would lead the jury astray, turning its focus away from whether the defendant, the only person whose actions are on trial. That's why the title of this article or the thumbnail is Brian Kohberger is the only one who can be guilty. Brian Kohberger is the only one who can be guilty. Confusing the jury about the possibility that somebody else could have been guilty, not tolerable. The only person who can be guilty is Brian Kohberger because he's the one on trial. He's the only one who can be guilty because he's on trial. The only person whose actions are on trial committed these charged crimes. It also presents a threat of unfair prejudice. Well, I'm so glad, Hippler, that you're afraid of unfair prejudice in this matter and not the unfair prejudice of the 4 or 5 documentaries, multiple books, all the shit that's coming out, 2 of which another documentary, another book are coming out before you're seating the jury in the next few weeks. But that's okay. That's not unfair prejudice. We don't want them getting unfairly prejudiced about thinking about alternative suspects, for God's sake, because we know who did it, and Brian Kohberger is the only person who's allowed to be guilty in this case. And yes, I'm using a lot of rhetoric. And if you don't like my theory and you think I'm overstating it, fine. But you came here for my opinion, and I'm giving it to you with both barrels today. Finally, it would do nothing more than waste the precious time of the jury and the court in what is already a scheduled 3-month trial. Nonetheless, the court's ruling does not preclude the defendant from confronting and cross-examining the state's law enforcement witnesses regarding the thoroughness of their investigation, particularly in following up on and ruling out leads generally. So, Hippler, universal translator, you're wasting the fucking jury's time. You're wasting all of our time to talk about anything else. Nevertheless, I'll allow you assholes to waste the jury's time a little bit if you want to suggest that law enforcement didn't properly follow those leads. And again, this is why I tell you, I still think Jack DeCour is on Ann Taylor's list of potential suspects, because that's a lead that they basically had and they ruled it out. They said that we've covered him. He has an alibi. He has no better motive than the incel next door who just hates women that he never met. There's no better motive than that. Indeed, The Idaho Court of Appeals recently found in an unpublished opinion that questioning a detective about failing to follow up on other plausible leads was relevant to alternative perpetrator analysis. Oh, good for you, Hippler. So if you can get a law enforcement officer under oath, under cross-examination, to admit that they maybe didn't follow up on a lead, maybe higher level courts, because your ass isn't going to do it, but maybe a higher level court has agreed that that's actually something that you should actually look into. That if an officer didn't follow up on leads properly, that for God's sake, I guess higher courts have said it's okay to question that. So if you go there and you can prove that an officer may not have followed up on a lead, then I guess the higher courts are going to overrule my ass. Because if it was my ass, I would just tell you you're wasting everyone's time. We agree with Emerson that a relevant line of inquiry would be to question the scope and the breadth of the investigation and to explore on cross whether plausible investigation leads about third parties were ignored and overlooked. So again, the silver lining of this whole thing, Hippler is going to allow Ann Taylor to question law enforcement about how they ruled people out, how they ruled other suspects out, and basically expose the possibility that they might have moved too quickly, which is exactly, by the way, exactly what Steve Gonsalves said in the early stages of this investigation, that he believed they ruled people out too quickly. That's all Ann Taylor's saying. You guys ruled people out too quickly. There were other people with motives, but you ruled them out and said they had an alibi. And Hippler says, yeah, they have alibis. Let's move on. You're wasting our time. Those guys have already been cleared. But I guess I have to by fucking law. The damn law requires me to allow you to cross these guys and say on cross whether or not they did it properly or not. So my hands are tied. I have to actually admit that the higher courts will allow you, because that shit ain't gonna fly in my court. You're wasting my time. But because the higher courts will allow you to cross the cross-exam the law enforcement, I guess I'll allow you to cross-exam the prosecution's witnesses, the law enforcement. And if you can show somehow and convince me, which you're never going to convince me, Hippler's words. You're never going to convince me. But if you can show me and prove to me that maybe that they didn't follow up on it properly, maybe I'll rule in your favor. But wink, wink, nod, nod. Good luck. You're not going to get that. I'm just going to give you some lip service and say you're allowed to question law enforcement on the stand. So while evidence challenging thoroughness and reliability of the investigation might be probative, questioning whether law enforcement investigated specific individuals with no connection to the murder, like ex-boyfriends or drug dealers behind the house that might have provided drugs. Anyways. All right. While evidence challenging the thoroughness and reliability of the investigation might be probative, questioning whether law enforcement investigated specific individuals with no connection to the murder, provided no probative evidence. Moreover, with no connection between the evidence and the crime, there is no explanation or justification for the questioning, and it would not help the jury answer the only question in the case, whether Emerson killed James. That was a quote from a previous thing. So again, in Hippler's mind, the only question before us is, did Brian Kohberger kill these women or not? And confusing the jury about other people who might have motives is a waste of everyone's time. But I have to allow you to do it because that's the fucking law, and I have no way around that. So he may inquire as to the reasonableness of the investigation. So that's Kohberger's team may inquire as to the reasonableness of the investigation, including investigating and ruling out other leads. He is not, however, permitted to question law enforcement about the investigation of any specific individual as a potential alternative perpetrator without first raising the matter with the court outside the jury's presence. What does that mean? They can't say, hey, how did you rule out Jack DeCour? Hippler has stated, you're not allowed to say someone's fucking name in front of the jury. So if you can finagle law enforcement on the stand to admit that maybe they didn't fully follow up on some lead without name, if you can get to that point, then you can go and take the name in private outside the jury's presence, and we can talk about what person you think specifically they didn't properly vet. But don't you dare say anybody's name in front of the jury about who they didn't follow up the leads with. Signed, Judge Hippler, completely biased. I reject your reality and substitute my own. Thanks for listening.